Today is Saturday, June 28th. Today, we're explaining and analyzing America's involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict. We go over the arguments for and against the U.S. dropping bombs on Iranian nuclear sites last weekend, and discuss whether the current ceasefire between Israel and Iran is expected to last. We'll also talk about the impact on ordinary citizens, the potential for a retaliatory terror attack on the U.S., and what it could mean for nuclear weapons, regime change, and even the ongoing war in Gaza. Today, we're joined by Professor Ned Lazarus. He's an expert in conflict resolution and Middle East peace building at George Washington University. He's helping us understand the short and long-term implications, the political calculations, and whether diplomacy still has a chance to help.
Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, when we provide all the day's news in just 10 minutes. It's fast, fair, fun, and on the go. I'm Erica Mandy. It's time for today's Special Edition Saturday. You ready? Let's do this.
Ned Lazarus, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thank you, Erica.
Well, first, I would just like to get your view so far of the ceasefire between Israel and Iran happening right now, and do you expect it will hold?
I do think that it will hold at least for a while. These agreements work when all of the parties involved want them to. I think that Iran has absorbed a tremendous set of blows from Israel. Their government is most likely reeling from what has been done to them. And I think that Israel both feels that it has achieved many of its goals and in some ways has even been more successful than expected, but it has also absorbed some very painful missile attacks from Iran that have killed 28 Israelis. And certainly our president clearly is very invested in the ceasefire because he immediately reprimanded the Israelis and the Iranians when he felt that they were not respecting the ceasefire in the last few hours before it was supposed to go into effect.
Did you get the sense that he forced it? Because he made the first announcement and then everyone seemed to get on board a day or two later. What do you think happened there behind the scenes?
This often happens with these very intense wars in the Middle East. When there is a ceasefire, sometimes there is an escalation during the 12 hours or 24 hours before the ceasefire goes into effect, meaning there may still be targets that, like the Israeli military, I think, had a lot of targets they wanted to hit before the ceasefire, or a side may want to just demonstrate that they are not surrendering and that they can still do damage. And I think the Iranians felt that way and unleashed a missile barrage which killed more people and destroyed a city block in Israel. And so both sides wanted to take shots before the ceasefire went into effect. But I don't think that they wanted to prevent the ceasefire. But I do think that surprised and frustrated the president.
There are now some conflicting reports about the damage the U.S. did or didn't do to Iran nuclear sites last weekend when the U.S. dropped some bombs on those nuclear sites. Both coming out of the U.S., there's some conflicting reports, as well as between the U.S. and Iran. What's your takeaway from this, and how much does the amount of damage actually matter?
Well, it is certainly hard to make sense of it. And if you're confused, then that means you're paying attention. There are different reports, as you said, from within the U.S. The Defense Intelligence Agency has released at least one report saying that the damage was not significant. The president and now the Secretary of Defense have both come out very strongly denying that report and saying that the damage was extensive and that we're talking about the very large reactor at a site called Fordo in Iran, which was buried under a mountain deep underground. And the reason the U.S. got involved was that only the United States possesses bombs that are called bunker busters that can go that deep underground. The Israelis do not have that technology. And so that's why the U.S. joined the attack, with the sense that there wouldn't be a definitive setback to the Iranian nuclear weapons program unless the Fordo site was put out of service. So the dispute is really whether Fordo was incapacitated, and there are conflicting accounts. What I have read is that European intelligence services are also saying they're not sure that there was significant damage or sufficient damage. The Israelis are somewhere in between. what I've heard from Israeli sources, that there was significant damage, but that there's also still not a conclusive sense that this was totally put out of commission. And there is a question about a stockpile of uranium that had been very highly enriched. It had been enriched to 60%, and that brings it close to 90% enrichment, which is where it becomes useful for a nuclear weapon. And so the debates are about whether Iran, knowing that this may happen, moved their stockpile of highly enriched uranium in advance, and that it now is stored or hidden at an undisclosed location somewhere else in the country.
Do you expect that we will get a clearer picture? And do you think there's any validity to critics of President Trump who worry that he will say whatever he wants to say to make himself look good, regardless of the intelligence?
I think you always have to take with a grain of salt what you hear from politicians and from people and groups that have a strong interest in what the answer is going to be about something like this. But I also think that you can understand a few basic things, which is that those bombs are incredibly powerful and that it's hard to believe that they didn't do extensive damage to at least the operational capacity of that site. We know that the Israelis did tremendous damage to the other known nuclear facilities on Iran. Actually, the director, Rafael Grossi, the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who might be a better, at least a less politicized source, also believes that a very significant damage was done and that the program has been set back for some years.
Let's go through some of the pros and cons of the U.S. getting involved in the first place by hitting those nuclear sites last weekend. I know you mentioned that the U.S. is the only one that has these certain bombs that can actually impact that facility. Can you speak to a few of those arguments?
Yeah, I think that the American public, and we can see it conclusively in public opinion surveys, and not just one party or the other, but I think more broadly, is very wary of becoming entangled in long wars in the Middle East, particularly after the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think that President Trump himself has long been very opposed to that kind of thing. And so there were many people who were questioning, why would he do this? He's been against going to war. He said he's going to end wars. He's going to make peace. And so I think that is probably the biggest source of concern, of questioning for Americans, just not wanting to get entangled into the war between Israel and Iran. I think, why did the president make the decision to strike Iran? I think first, the Israelis had already done most of the hard work, and Iran, as we said, was completely vulnerable and really wasn't in a position to launch a significant counterattack, and they didn't. And at least not at that time. They may do something, down the line. Iran may attack U.S. facilities in the Middle East later, but I think that the president, he likes winners. And I think that he perhaps wanted to get on to what was the side that was winning in this case. But I think he also, it was as close to a quote unquote surgical strike as you get, meaning this was a very specifically defined operation. It was showcasing the U.S.'s military power that no other nation possesses, and that's something that you can see would appeal to Trump. And in some sense, I think that it does establish some credibility in the sense that while on the one hand, Trump favors negotiations and is not interested in getting entangled in wars, he made a demonstration that if he issues a threat, it's credible.
And my understanding is there's already been some cyber attack attempts on U.S. infrastructure.
That's entirely possible. And I think that kind of thing, I think, happens frequently. And so that is a low-cost way for Iran to try and strike back. But I think that it is certainly possible that we would see some other kind of Iranian response further down the line. Another thing that I'm not saying is going to happen immediately, but I think is quite plausible, is that Israel may attack a site in Iran if they sense that the regime is trying to restart its nuclear program or its ballistic missile program. So part of the Israeli campaign was also to degrade as much as possible Iran's ballistic missiles. It has fired ballistic missiles during this war and then twice in the year previous at Israel. And the Israeli air defenses aim, with help from allies from the United States primarily, and sometimes regional allies, is able to shoot down a lot of them, I think 90+% of them. But even if just one gets through, these are enormous missiles and they do tremendous damage. They killed, as I said, I think 28 people, and really some of them destroyed entire city blocks in major cities in Israel. And this is part of Iran. I think the Ayatollah today in his message saying that Iran was victorious. Well, Iran was obviously not victorious, but they did certainly cause damage and death in Israel.
Still ahead, could and should at this moment lead to a regime change in Iran? What about a new U.S.-Iran nuclear deal? And what is a best and worst case scenario from here? Plus, why our expert guest thinks there's now an opportunity to use this situation to end the war in Gaza for good. That's coming up, but first, a break for our sponsors. Whether it's the school year, the summer, or we're on vacation, my kiddo always takes his Hiya Children's vitamins and probiotics. He loves them for the taste and routine. He'll excitedly run over to take them. And I love them for all the health benefits. Hiya's Children's vitamins are pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals. I also appreciate that every single batch is third-party tested for heavy metals and microbials in a qualified, GMP-compliant lab using scientifically validated testing methods. And unlike others, it has no sugar or gummy junk. And if you're tired of battling with your kids to eat their greens, Hiya now has Kids Daily Greens Plus Superfoods, a chocolate-flavored greens powder designed specifically for kids, packed with 55 whole food ingredients to support brain power, development, and digestion. Just scoop, shake, and sip with milk or any non-dairy beverage for a delicious and nutritious boost your kids will actually enjoy. So we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order, that's half off. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/newsworthy. The deal is not available on their regular website, so go to hiyahealth.com/newsworthy and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by OneSkin. Of course, getting older comes with some visible signs of aging. For our face, it might mean lines, wrinkles, and sagging skin. For our scalp, which is also skin, by the way, it messes with your hair follicles and natural growth cycle. For both, I turn to OneSkin. Their OS1 peptide targets all those aging cells, and the OS1 hair is the first scalp serum powered by OneSkin's OS1 peptide. It's scientifically proven to help your hair cells do what they're meant to do, grow fuller, denser, healthier hair. I love that there's a simple, straightforward, and scientifically backed thing I can do for the health of my skin, scalp, and hair. Founded and led by an all-women team of skin longevity scientists, OneSkin is redefining the aging process with their proprietary OS1 peptide. Get 15% off with the code NEWSWORTHY at oneskin.co. That's 15% off oneskin.co with the code NEWSWORTHY. After your purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them, so please support our show and tell them we sent you. Invest in the health and longevity of your skin and scalp with OneSkin. Your future self will thank you. Now back to my conversation with Ned Lazarus. What does this mean for the people, not necessarily the governments, but the citizens in Iran?
This is a very big question. During the war, the question of whether this will weaken or topple the Islamic Republic, the Iranian regime, came up frequently. The Iranian regime is very unpopular with a significant part of their population. We can see that in every decade there is a major outbreak of protest, even popular uprising, really, which often lasts for several weeks. So there are very large groups within the Iranian citizenry that do not want that regime. However, I don't know of something that could come in and take its place. What I mean by that, I don't know of an organized opposition that would be able to take over to seize power. We saw recently a dictatorship that the world thought was stable collapse in about a week. That was in Syria. The Assad regime that had been in power, father and son, for 50 years and had seemingly won a long and bloody civil war to retain control. Once the Israelis really weakened Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militia that had helped prop up Assad's regime, one of the surviving rebel groups took over the country in about a week. But that rebel group, who are now the leaders of Syria, Ahmad al-Shara, the new president, they were an organized, cohesive fighting force. They had a shared ideology. They had been fighting the regime for 10 years. So they were an organized political force, a political and military force that was able to take advantage of the weakening of the regime. In Iran, I don't know of forces that are able to do that, and I think that is a challenge.
Do you think regime change was in the plans at all for Israel or the U.S. in terms of their action? Again, there were conflicting reports out of the U.S., or out of the White House, I should say, about whether this was about regime change or not.
I do not think that was one of the goals of the military operation. I think that in the United States and in Israel, no one would shed a tear if the Islamic Republic were to lose power and a more democratic government and less hostile government were to take over in Iran. So in the longer term, I would say that a change of the Iranian regime would certainly be seen as a desirable goal, and there is a hope that taking out their nuclear program and revealing their weakness will help. But that was not what they were trying. You can't change a regime with air power. If you're trying to change a regime, you need to send in troops and take over the country, or you need to ally with forces on the ground. I didn't see any of that happening.
Especially before the ceasefire, we heard some people taking this to the extreme and saying this could be the start of World War III. Do you think there's been any truth to that, or is that overblown?
It's overblown. Yeah, I'm an academic and I can talk for a long time about a lot of things, but yeah, I think that's said again because people have a justified wariness of military entanglements in the Middle East. But again, this was a very clearly defined and limited military strike.
When we're thinking about a potential deal, about what can President Trump, does he still want a deal? Can we talk a little bit about, there was a deal with President Obama that basically said, let us check and make sure you're not building nuclear weapons, and in exchange we'll lift some economic sanctions on you, right? Then President Trump said that deal was not fair to the U.S. He got rid of it and then was trying to do another deal that we haven't seen get done. What do you think is important to note when looking back on that part of the equation in terms of a deal with Iran?
There is some irony. President Trump, I think I remember him saying that he thought the Iran deal was the worst agreement that's ever been negotiated, and using his usual hyperbole. And in the months before this war started, President Trump was very deeply engaged in negotiations with the Iranians on a deal that wasn't exactly the same, but didn't look that different. Now, I do think that the terms have probably changed. I think that both the previous deal and also the deal that Trump was negotiating, I think the Israelis, and not just Netanyahu, but more broadly, I think, are skeptical of those deals because they believe that it would give Iran time and money, meaning it would give sanctions relief, which Iran would then use either to secretly put things in place to advance to nuclear weapons, or use to build up their conventional capacities, their ballistic missile capacities, and to build up their proxy militias around the region, Hezbollah, the groups in Iraq and in Yemen.
Anything to note about the financial cost of America's attack on Iran's facilities, as well as the potential cost of increasing escalation or other impacts we could feel?
I think that they probably took those things into account. One of Iran's potential avenues of retaliation would be to close the Straits of Hormuz, which are where I think it's 20% of the oil in the world goes through. And so that could cause a real shock that would raise gas prices and cause a lot of economic discomfort and then probably political anger in the United States. The Iranians did not choose to do that. One of their main sources of revenue right now is selling oil to China, and China depends on that oil, and that oil goes through the same strait. So what I'm thinking is that probably the U.S. thought that through and thought that it's unlikely that Iran is going to retaliate that way.
What would you say, at least briefly, about the potential best and worst case scenarios for how this ultimately ends up, and where do you expect it to fall?
I think a worst case scenario would be that Iran has retained some capability and that they managed to secretly rush toward production of a nuclear bomb and demonstrate that in the way that the North Korean regime did. And that has led to that regime remaining entrenched, terrorizing its people and remaining a threat to Korea and Japan. And so that would be a worst case scenario. I would say a best case scenario would be an eventual negotiation between Iran and the United States, in which Iran really makes a strategic decision that it's too costly to continue nuclear enrichment and where they commit to verifiably dismantling their nuclear program. I want to say that for me, and I think for people who have been watching the war in Gaza, a real best case scenario would also be if Trump might leverage this to try and create some pressure towards ending the war in Gaza and releasing all of the hostages. There are still 50 Israelis held hostage, at least 20 of whom are still alive by Hamas in Gaza. There is still daily lethal warfare there. This civilian population in Gaza is still suffering tremendously. And you can hear this actually in the Israeli media. Many of the families of people being held hostage have said, how is it that our country has such extraordinary capabilities? They can assassinate the leaders of the Iranian nuclear program. They can destroy the air defenses of Iran and conduct this incredible air campaign. But we can't get people home who are being held right next door in tunnels for more than 600 days. So that, and a poll I've seen said that 62% of Israelis want to end the war in Gaza in exchange for the release of hostages. Unfortunately, the current government is very committed to continuing the war in Gaza because the extreme right parties in that government demand that, and Netanyahu is afraid to lose their support. But I do think that maybe one ideal outcome could be if Trump, who has said many times that he wants that war to end, if he could use this, and he certainly has a lot of credit with Netanyahu now. He just did him a tremendous favor, so to speak. And if he could cash that in to help bring the tragedy in Gaza and the tragedy of the hostages to a close, I do think that he will be remembered very positively for having achieved that.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. We appreciate it. Big thanks to our guest today, Professor Ned Lazarus from George Washington University. If you found this episode helpful, we always appreciate it if you share it with a friend. And of course, we'll keep you up to date on any significant developments in the region and beyond, along with all the other news to know, during our regular 10-minute daily news updates every Monday through Friday. Thanks again for putting up with my scratchy voice today while I continue to fight a cold. I am hoping to have my regular voice back very soon. Either way, we'll be back on Monday with the latest news to know. Until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend.